Hello and welcome to the second webinar of Season 2 of the Asia Undercurrent series. I am Zach Cooper, and I'm pleased to be able to moderate this discussion, which is hosted by the government of Japan and Nikkei. We are talking today about the Quad, the grouping among the United States, India, Australia, and Japan, which is playing an increasingly important role, not just in Asian security, but in global security and a broader set of issues as well. As you all know, quadrilateral cooperation has risen to prominence amid growing geopolitical strains, and as the Quad has come to the forefront in the region, it has taken on a broad range of activities encompassing everything from security to health to supply chain cooperation. But questions remain about how effective the Quad can be at addressing this wide range of challenges. The invasion of Ukraine, economic uncertainty coming out of the COVID crisis, growing aggressiveness by China, and human rights and democracy issues all pose serious challenges for the Quad countries. So in order to better understand the challenges facing the Quad and how it can overcome them, we've brought together a panel of leading experts as a prelude to the Quad Summit meeting that will be held in Tokyo on May 24th. So we're joined today by our own Quad of fantastic panelists from the United States, India, Australia, and Japan. They each have written substantially on the Quad. I'll just briefly introduce each of them before turning to them for remarks. So first we have Michael Auslin. He's the Payson J. Treat Distinguished Research Fellow in Contemporary Asia at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Next, we have Brahma Chellaney, Professor Emeritus at the Center for Policy Research. And then Hayley Channer, Senior Policy Fellow at the Perth US-Asia Center. And finally, Ken Jimbo, Professor at the Faculty of Policy Management at Keio University. So we'll start with 5 minutes of remarks from each of our wonderful panelists, and then we'll ask the audience to join in the discussion for questions and answers. To ask a question, please scroll down to the Q&A function. And as you enter your question, please make sure that you include your name and affiliation alongside your question. So with that, Michael, over to you for 5 minutes of opening remarks. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Zach, and thank you to Nikkei and to the government of Japan for pulling together not just this episode, but the entire series, which I think is extremely important, especially for us here in the States, speaking as an American, to be getting perspectives from around the region and around the world. And for us to be talking about the Quad today, of course, the timing is perfect. President Biden will be going next week on the 24th for the second Quad leaders meeting. Of course, he'll also be going to South Korea, and he'll be seeing the new Korean president. And there's going to be a lot of questions, I think, about the effectiveness of the Quad going forward, particularly in the post-Ukraine world. So maybe what I'll do is be a little bit more of a skeptic this morning, and then that might possibly spur some debate and discussion amongst the panelists and amongst the audience. I don't think I know of anyone who works on Asian issues who is not a Quad supporter. I think everyone has waited actually a long time to see it revived. It was revived under the Trump administration in 2017 after a bit of a start in 2007. Really, in many ways, the idea of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan during his first term and then coming back in his second and much longer term. Everyone, I think, has been waiting for something that would seem to be the next generation in cooperation amongst liberal nations in Asia. The Biden administration took what the Trump administration did and as they would say in Japan, leveled it up. Making it as a regular for leaders meetings, not only the meetings of principals like the ministers and secretaries of state. But I think there are questions as to how far the Quad can go, and there would be general questions anyway, given four very large, important nations with their own foreign policies and their own goals. But I would say in the post-Ukraine world, there's real questions as to the focus that the Quad should be taking. While the Quad does do some security-related activities, most of it is really not focused directly on security. And the Quad statements have actually been very careful to be talking about things like cooperation, development, obviously vaccine diplomacy, and the like. But in a post-Ukraine world, the real concerns of nations are with power politics, with Machtpolitik, with the use of aggression to change borders and to gain national security goals of whatever nation. Obviously, if we're talking about Asia, we're largely, though not exclusively, talking about China. So will the Quad shift its focus? Can it shift its focus? Can there be agreement among the four partners that security really needs to be, at least in the short run and maybe the medium run, the main focus of what the Quad does in order to provide the assurances that the region wants that security will be maintained? And more specifically, and I know my colleague, Professor Chellaney, will talk about this, there are already splits in the Quad over dealing with Ukraine and Russia, and the splits between India and the other Quad partners, I think, are significant. They should not be brushed under the rug or ignored. The question is whether the leaders next week will actually address it directly, and what it will tell them about how far their partnership can go together. So to sum up, I would say that the Quad is a long needed, a long hoped for evolution in cooperation amongst liberal nations in the region. But like all aspirational groupings or aspirational initiatives, it has a lot of bumps ahead of it. It would have had those bumps anyway, but I think Ukraine has really brought to the fore the question about whether the Quad will focus on the things that likely are to be most of concern to nations around the world, but in the region, which is security. And that we will have to wait and see if they grasp that nettle and try to figure out just how far they can work together. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Great opening remarks, and that connects nicely to Brahma Chellaney. Brahma, you've written a lot on the Quad, but most recently a piece for Project Syndicate, which I think is really thoughtful, asking many of these same questions about the role of the Quad going forward. So over to you for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Zach. The Quad is central to the US-led strategy of a free and open Indo-Pacific. This region, as the world's economic and geopolitical hub, will shape the new international order. The Quad's importance remains intact despite the new Biden-initiated AUKUS alliance with Australia and Britain. The US cannot build a stable Asian power balance without India, Japan, and Australia, nor can Japan, Australia, and India build it without America. The Quad today faces some important challenges. In my view, these challenges have not really changed because of the war in Ukraine. Let me quickly identify three of the basic challenges that the Quad faces today. The first challenge is to increase trade among the Quad members rather than with China. Unfortunately, all four Quad members have increased their trade dependencies on China. China still accounts for nearly 1/3 of Australia's global trade. China is also Japan's largest export destination. The US and India, for their part, play an important role in boosting Chinese economic and military power by helping Beijing reap growing trade surpluses. These trade surpluses are the main engine driving the Chinese economy today. America's trade deficit with China now makes up nearly 60% of China's total trade surplus with the world. India, as you may know, is the world's third largest defense spender. What is remarkable about China's trade surplus with India is that it has already surpassed India's defense budget, that too at a time when the two countries are locked in a dangerous military confrontation along their long Himalayan frontier, following some Chinese encroachments on Indian border areas. The second challenge is to complement the Quad's security role with a concretized Indo-Pacific economic dimension so that economic and security interests are fused. Otherwise, if its members pick economic interests over security interests, the Quad's relevance will erode. Australia and Japan, for example, have helped bring the Beijing promoted RCEP into force. RCEP and China's Belt and Road Initiative underscore the imperative for an economic pillar to give the Quad more comprehensive meaning. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who authored the original free and open Indo-Pacific concept, he had built his concept around an economic pillar. The Biden administration is likely to soon unveil its quote-unquote Indo-Pacific economic framework. This won't be a Quad initiative. Rather, it'll be open to all Indo-Pacific states, but without Team Biden committing better resources to this region or offering its partners better access to the US market. The third challenge is for the Quad member states to give the Quad a clear strategic direction and meaning. An increasingly expansive agenda is threatening to dilute the Quad's Indo-Pacific strategic focus and even undercut its strategic rationale to serve as a bulwark against Chinese expansionism. The three previous summit meetings since last year attest to the fact that the Quad has turned its attention to everlasting global challenges from climate change, which is Biden's pet concern, and cybersecurity, to global health and supply chains. Meanwhile, the war in Ukraine and the deepening US involvement in that conflict raise new uncertainties about the Quad's direction. Biden is the third successive US president to commit to shifting America's primary strategic focus to Asia and the wider Indo-Pacific region. But as he pours military resources into Europe, there is concern that, like his two immediate predecessors, Barack Obama and then Donald Trump, Biden too would fail to genuinely pivot to the Indo-Pacific. So to sum up, the Quad has come a long way towards cementing a strategic coalition of the leading democracies of the Indo-Pacific. It continues to gain in strength. The change of administrations in the US and Japan last year, far from slowing momentum, has helped build continuity, making the Quad's future more durable. Yet it's also important to acknowledge that the Quad, 4.5 years after it was resurrected, faces new challenges that must be addressed so that it becomes more robust as an initiative. The Quad's Tokyo summit, a week from today, will be critical in setting the group's direction. Thank you, Jack.
Thank you, Brahma's wonderful comments. And we'll now turn to Hayley Channer. Hayley, you've worked on these issues both in government and in the think tank world. So really looking forward to your thoughts about where the Quad is headed. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Zach. And can I also extend my thanks to the government of Japan and to Nikkei for hosting this event. And just as my other speakers, my co-panelists are talking, it has made me think, I wonder if this is a microcosm of what Quad meetings are really like. Because on the one hand, I strongly disagree with some points, and on the other hand, I strongly agree with some points. So I wonder if we aren't getting a little bit of insight here, having our 4 countries represented. What I'm going to do with my remarks is the first thing I'm going to do is talk about the Australian perspective of the Quad, and then I'm going to talk about my own personal perspective of the Quad. So the Quad Summit next Tuesday is coming, but depending on what happens this Saturday, will actually determine who from Australia attends. This Saturday, Australia is going to go to the polls in its own federal election, and either Australia's current Conservative Prime Minister or the progressive opposition leader is going to attend the Quad Summit. Perhaps surprisingly, the Quad has actually featured in the Australian election campaign because the current government has called into question whether or not the Labor government would support the framework. You see, the current government really blames the opposition for killing the Quad back in 2008. But the main point is that whichever party wins this election, Australia is going to continue to support and really back in the Quad for 2 main reasons. Reason number one is Australia's really lost faith in the ability of larger multilateral groups in the Indo-Pacific, groups like the East Asia Summit, like ASEAN dialogues, to do practical security things. And Australia sees the Quad as offering the best possible alternative. The second thing is that because the Quad puts Australia on a pedestal alongside three of the world's strongest economic, military, and geopolitical powers. So it really does elevate Australia's regional and global standing. And if the Quad really gets its act together, it also stands a chance of having its members pool their skills and resources and create outcomes bigger than the sum of their individual parts. So take the Quad's COVID-19 vaccine pledge as an example. Each of the four Quad nations are bringing something unique and distinct to that COVID vaccine partnership, which really justifies why the cooperation should happen under the Quad and not some other mechanism. And it's also about providing positive messaging to the region and public goods. For Australia as well, getting more vaccine doses into arms around the region is going to be really important for us because we want a stable regional environment. And we also want to kickstart the free flow of people and goods, which the Australian economy relies on, because our three biggest exports being coal, iron ore, and actually education. But there's also obviously a bigger strategic game in play here, even though officials from some of the Quad countries don't readily always admit this. And that's that if the four Quad countries can successfully cooperate on shared goals in the Indo-Pacific, we'll demonstrate the benefits of having liberal democratic practices and the benefits of those systems over Chinese models. And we'll also lay the foundation for a strategic counterweight to China. So if we succeed in this could have the effect of complicating Beijing's political and geoeconomic calculations, but not likely its military calculations, because regardless of Quad Navy cooperation in Exercise Malabar, for example, there's unlikely to be any scenario where military strategies and objectives of all four Quad nations align in a way that would allow them to counter China militarily. So now just personally talking about my personal perception of the Quad and how it could create a free and open Indo-Pacific. I'm going to make 3 points. My first point is that although linked, seeing the Quad through the prism of China really limits the Quad's potential. The second point I'm going to make is that the Quad is overpromised and underdelivered, and the only remedy for that is to adequately resource its existing commitments. And the third point I'll make is that the biggest pitfall of the Quad will be its expansion. And hopefully this is an area where we can really get in and nut out the debate. But by expansion, I mean expansion of its focus, expansion of its members, and its expansion beyond the Indo-Pacific region. So just on seeing the Quad through the prism of China, all discussions about the Quad seem to start with the assumption that the best thing the Quad could ever achieve, and therefore its reason for existing, is to counter China. This sets the Quad up to fail, number one. And number two, it diminishes the importance of other things the Quad could actually achieve. Yes, the Quad band came back together in 2017 as a result of Chinese aggression, and all four countries see China as their biggest strategic threat. But China isn't the only problem that all four countries face. And why form a group only in response to China when they could try and make progress across a whole range of other areas like supply chain resilience, critical technologies, health security, climate change? So I think because the Quad came back together came together originally in 2004, it was in response to a major crisis, the Boxing Day tsunami and earthquake. And again, we're seeing it come back together because of a major crisis, and that's the COVID-19 pandemic. So the Quad is really the most successful when it focuses on a major regional challenge that delivers public goods rather than focusing on countering China. That second point I'll make is that the Quad has overpromised and underdelivered. So although the Quad's had multiple meetings at the leaders level and the foreign secretary level, and it's made a lot of announcements, right now, the only practical thing the Quad has done is deliver 10% of its 1 billion COVID vaccines to the Indo-Pacific. Now, if you'll recall, former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo used to call the Quad his security diamond. Well, diamonds take billions of years to form, but at the end of that, you're expecting to get a diamond. And if you don't get a diamond, then you're really disappointed. You're just waiting around. So I think it's really important the Quad actually deliver on its commitments. And the final point I'll make is that the Quad's biggest Achilles heel will be its expansion of areas, which is something that Brahma talked about in his last point, its expansion of members, and its expansion outside the Indo-Pacific to look at things like Ukraine. Something I wanted to say on this point is that the Quad has actually announced cooperation in 12 separate areas. And the areas aren't specific, they're really broad. I won't mention all 12 of them, but it's not just COVID vaccines or climate change or technology or cyber or infrastructure or supply chains. There's just too many things for the Quad to focus on. And in a paper that I wrote for my own Perth US Asia Centre, I really drilled down into 3 areas that I think the Quad should focus on. And they are critical technology like digital communications for Southeast Asia and the Pacific, infrastructure, and supply chains. And then on this issue of whether or not we should expand Quad membership and the so-called Quad Plus, I would just make the point that anything more than 4 is no longer a Quad, it's multilateralism. And what we should do is not call it Quad Plus, because that really relegates the Plus members to a sort of subordinate add-on and not equal partners. And obviously, the Quad brand also carries a lot of baggage in terms of being seen as an anti-China coalition. So I really think we should drop the Quad Plus tagline. And then the final point I'll make is that we shouldn't be looking beyond the Indo-Pacific. When we look beyond the Indo-Pacific, what happens is, for example, when the Quad decided to announce a new humanitarian assistance initiative for Ukraine, what that means is really it exposes the differences between the 4 Quad countries, something that Michael alluded to earlier, because India has a lot of military cooperation with Russia. It buys a lot of material from Russia. So when the Quad leaves the Indo-Pacific, it really exposes its own soft underbelly and opens itself up to criticism immediately. So to recap my 3 points, I think what we need to do is avoid talking about the Quad as if it's the solution to the China problem. We need Quad governments to dedicate resources to their domestic agencies to deliver on their commitments, and the Quad needs to stay small.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Hayley. And now we'll turn to Ken Jimbo. Ken, you've spent a huge amount of time working on the Quad, both its bilateral relationships, but also thinking about how it applies in Southeast Asia. So very much looking forward to your comments.
Well, thank you very much, Zach, and thank you all for a kind invitation to this great gathering. Over past years, it is important to stress how much the concept of Indo-Pacific gains the gravity of cooperation, not only among regional members like Quad ourselves, but also countries outside the region, including Europe, Middle East, East Africa, and even Latin America. And remember, Ecuador is now applying for CPTPP. So I believe the Indo-Pacific is the leading concept of the decade. And we have enough reason to invest and engage. And among various mechanisms and regional groupings, the Quad is obviously the most important power group to shape the regional order. But that said, as I really concur with everyone, Quad is still the evolutionary stage of development. And at this stage, trying to put all the eggs into the basket of Quad may be too heavy, loaded. Some argue that we should aim for the Asian version of NATO based on the Quad. And some expect the Quad should be the group of 4 leading every strategic issue among ourselves ahead of any kind of multilateral grouping that we belong to. But I think we are far from such goals. And I don't believe we are aiming to get these goals. So we are okay if China overestimates the role of Quad, as they often do so, but we should not overestimate ourselves. So I would argue that the essence of the Quad remains to be resting in each of our bilateral relationships. And simply because our capabilities are highly asymmetrical in terms of how much we can project power in the wider region. And sometimes our policy priorities are essentially different. I don't want to be too much US-centric viewpoint here, but engaging United States in the each of sub-region that we face, that includes Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, Oceania, and also in the Indo-Pacific, Indian Ocean, through the sets of bilateral alliance and partnership is, to me, the number one priority of the Quad cooperation, within the Quad cooperation. And why we're doing a naval exercise is because 4 countries aiming to get together in each of maritime issues that we face in the region, and that is not the case as somebody previous speaker has mentioned, that we are always getting together to deal with every maritime issue that we face in the region. So we do that because we need deeper interoperability for sure, and we also need a common approaches to be referred in the every sub-region and enhance seamless US presence in the region. And I think that might be emphasized, what we should promote in the Quad cooperation. We can downplay the Quad because we cannot, always do the, joint actions, especially on the security domain, as Amisha has mentioned. But we can actually upgrade each of our bilateral relations to be cross-referred with each other. But I'm also all in for compiling functional cooperation where we can cooperate as much as possible. And those involve maritime security cooperation, capacity building efforts, especially for the maritime states in Southeast Asia, infrastructure investment and finance, as we have begun some of the programs, especially among the Japan-US-Australia financial schemes, collaborating on the digital technology does not only include the digital infrastructure, but also with digital services, and also the defense industry and procurements, and that also to be enhanced, especially to engage the future Indian procurements among ourselves. And I think those are in the longer term very important to get India on board in higher defense cooperation with us. And I'm also expecting to see cross agreements on the logistic arrangements such as AXA and reciprocal access agreements among like-minded states. And I think these will ensure the legal ground of cooperation to expand military to military function among us beyond the Quad. So again, I'm also curious how much we can advance the concept of the economic domain of the security concept in the upcoming summit. The economic security gained more importance, especially in the aftermath of the Ukraine crisis, reminding how important that our national economies are resilient and not to be hijacked or weaponized by through the over relying on one country or one sector. So diversifying our trades and investment destination is always a textbook type of answer. We also simultaneously need boosting economic rationale for our diversification measures because if we do so, and the losing competitiveness among ourselves is always completely opposite answer for the economic security. So the trade restriction, setting the entity list, investment screenings are what we all need. However, that should be coupled with the economic enhancement measures for our new investments. And so I hope that the Quad can be such a base for such kind of like a proactive economic cooperation, enhancing business relations and the more robust than what we have achieved so far. I'll stop here and look forward to the discussion. Thank you, Zach.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ken. Well, this is, I think, a wonderful set of opening comments, and we can already see a couple of the tensions emerging, right? And I think this is true not just of the commentators here, but broadly of the four countries, that there's a lot of alignment, of course, about what the Quad is doing and what it should do, but there are some areas where I think there are some difficult tensions. So before we go to the audience, I want to ask a couple of questions about a few of these areas which have already come up. So let's start with China. This came up in several of the remarks. Is the Quad really focused on China? Is it about China? Should it be about China? If you read many of the statements that have come out from the Quad leaders meetings or the foreign ministers, some of them don't even mention China at all. It's literally not in, for example, the op-ed that was written a year ago by the Quad leaders. And yet, I think at the core, what is true about the Quad is that all four countries really have a common desire to balance, at least to some degree, against China, including in the military domain. And this is part of what makes them different from some other countries in the region. So I want to ask, is the Quad really about China, and should it be? Or is it really more about the broader region, and should it be more disconnected from the China challenge? So Michael, I know you opened with a couple of remarks on this. I don't know if you want to jump in on this issue or if others would as well.
Well, look, I'd like it to be about the broader region, and I think in many ways it is, but I think it'd be disingenuous for us to pretend it's not about China. I mean, everyone understands it's about China. China either thinks it's about China or makes it about China, which then makes the Quad about China. The counterfactual would be to say, in the absence of China, would we have a Quad? And if we didn't have a Quad before we all worried about China, then isn't that positive in a sense of indicating what the concerns are? Now, the fact that it may be about China doesn't mean that everything the Quad has to do is related to China. And I think Hayley's points about if you make the Quad about China or opposing China or the answer to China, then you're setting it up for failure. And in many ways, I agree with that. So I think that there are few in the region who don't think that the greatest challenge, be it economic, be it ideological, be it political, and let alone security, is China. Then when you have the largest liberal nations coming together, it seems pretty clear that if they're not there to deal with the uncertainty and the instability created by that actor, then the question becomes, and then what's the Quad for? And I think the Quad can still do a lot of good things. But just one last point, which is, I think in some ways it's actually, I think Hayley's right. If you say the Quad is going to be the answer to China, it's going to fail. On the other hand, I think in some ways it's actually a lot easier to get the Quad to be focused on security. There's a high bar for that, but still, to get it to be focused on security than some of the other things that have been mentioned. I mean, our nations have such divergent views on digital standards and divergent views on trade and all sorts of other things that I think it's actually going to be harder to get the Quad to be an effective, united, issue-oriented group, meaning we've decided we're going to work together on this issue with all of these other things, because it gets to domestic issues, whereas the security is a foreign issue outside of domestic politics, mostly. And I think that that's how nations often find it easier to cooperate, because you don't have to take into account what's going on internally. But if the Quad starts getting bogged down, though I think these are very good ideas in general, if it starts getting bogged down in things like digital standards and the like, then I think it's going to be a big problem. And then finally, just very finally, Hayley's point that, or I think it was Hayley, whoever mentioned it, that only 10% of the billion doses have been for COVID vaccine have been distributed, if that in some way shouldn't have been the easiest thing the Quad could do, then I think, again, it indicates the difficulty of trying to get into these areas that seem good, but in the long run, sort of are peripheral to the thing that we're all most concerned about. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Michael. Brahma, Hayley, Ken, would any of you like to jump in on this as well?
Look, I was mentioned then, so I might just jump in quickly before Brahma. There's no question China is inextricably linked to the Quad. I mean, I don't want to give everyone a history lesson here, but what I would say is, the Quad originally came together in 2004 because of a disaster, but then it started meeting after that disaster because it realized, we've also got this problem with China, and we have strategic things we want to talk about together in private rooms. And then the Quad broke up because of China, because China was upset about it. China was concerned about it. It had made diplomatic protests. So the Quad disintegrated. And then the Quad came back together because of China. So yes, the Quad is about China, but the Quad is not going to be successful if it just runs at China as being an anti-China coalition. And what it actually can do is be offer more attractive things than Chinese models, because that's really how you're going to win the war of influence, and you're going to bring the entire Indo-Pacific region around. You're not going to win it by creating a coalition or a bloc against China. And to be honest, that can just expedite and get us closer to the conflict that we're all trying to avoid. So yes, the Quad is related to China, but the things that it's doing aren't directly to counter China. They're meant to be providing better alternatives to what China is offering. And, I didn't bore everyone by going through all the 12 things that the Quad is working on. But if you think about the cooperation, whether that's infrastructure, that could be to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative, or if it's about the COVID diplomacy, well, China also has COVID vaccines. And the same, with cyber and other areas of cooperation in maritime security. So the problems are parallel to China, but just talking about the Quad as if it is, anti-China is not going to benefit the framework, and it's not going to help those countries achieve what they ultimately want, which is a stable balance of power in the region in a kind of multipolar order where China is not hegemonic and all the other countries are playing their role in creating a stable region.
Fantastic. Brahma or Ken, do you want to jump in on this as well?
Well, if I could say a few words, it's good that the Quad doesn't mention China, because there's no need to mention China in any joint statement or a national statement. But the very purpose of the Quad was to help build a stable power equilibrium in the Indo-Pacific region. It was the Chinese expansionism in the South China Sea, which is the most critical corridor linking the Pacific and the Indian Oceans, that served as a wake-up call and led to the evolution of the Quad. But the Quad was not designed to be a military alliance, does not intend to be a military alliance. Yet, paradoxically, its purpose is to help rein in Chinese expansionism. How it does that is the challenge. So there is a strategic rationale driving the Quad, but the Quad is not a military initiative, nor does it have the means to help build a stable balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. So that leads us to what the Quad can deliver on. And I think the reference to the much touted vaccine initiative is a good example. This vaccine initiative was launched at the first summit meeting of the Quad in March last year. And when it was launched, there was hope that the Quad could make a difference at a time when COVID vaccines were in short supply in the Indo-Pacific and elsewhere. The plan was to manufacture more than 1 billion vaccines a year, especially the Johnson & Johnson vaccine for Southeast Asia and other parts of the world at India's Biological E company plants. Unfortunately, the Quad's vaccine initiative didn't live up to the promise. In fact, the Quad initiative on vaccines coincided with the Biden administration imposing an embargo on export of vaccine components and raw materials. That embargo disrupted vaccine production in Europe, in India, and elsewhere. Today, there's a glut of vaccines everywhere, despite the Quad's vaccine initiative not delivering on its promise. This is a reminder that the Quad must translate its rhetoric into action. I think Hayley's point about overpromising and underdelivering is a very valid one. Just having global health or COVID vaccination on your agenda means little. The Quad must focus on deliverables. For example, if there were to be a natural disaster somewhere in the Indo-Pacific, all 4 Quad members could undertake joint rescue and relief operations. That could be one example of how the Quad is coming together to deal with an emergency.
Well, that's very thoughtful, Brahma, and I think it gets us towards a bit of an answer to the question of China and the Quad, which is that, of course, the Quad is sort of motivated in large part by China, but the Quad's actions don't have to be all about China, right? The responses may be in other domains. And Ken, I want to come to you and ask a question about one of those areas, which is the role of the Quad and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. There's been a fair amount written about this in Southeast Asia and questions about whether the Quad is a threat to Southeast Asia. Every Quad statement always mentions ASEAN centrality. And yet there's this feeling that, right, the Quad in some ways is sort of 4 pretty large and important countries surrounding Southeast Asia, right? Japan on the north, Australia to the south, and the United States and India to the east and west. And in the center, you have Southeast Asia, which isn't part of the Quad. So what should the role of the Quad and ASEAN be? Are these 2 groups potentially, in competition, or do you think the relationship can be more cooperative?
Well, I think obviously there has been the growing recognition that the ASEAN, the role of ASEAN could be diluted by the Quad cooperation enhancement, and overlooking the traditional role of the ASEAN for the consensus building for the norms and actions that will be taking place in the wider regions. So that basically there has been the more confrontational relationship between the ASEAN way of managing the region versus what the Quad is now enhancing. But I think ASEAN has recognizing that they also need their own robustness and reform in dealing with the ASEAN's staying the relevant status in the age of strategic competition. So this is a reason that they have adopted the ASEAN's own version of the outlook on the Indo-Pacific, although it's a very comprehensive nature of how they try to capitalize the concept of the Indo-Pacific. But it is very important to recognize that they adopted the concept of the Indo-Pacific. And we also find there have been a gradation among the ASEAN members, especially in response to Ukraine. Singapore has been very leaning forward. And by analyzing the voting behavior in the UN General Assembly, there have been somewhat find the nation who wish to commit more to those like a global nature of global coalition among the G7 plus members. And I think finding out, exploring those potential among those ASEAN members who can be partnering more with Quad associate members on the specific subjects. And I think a coalition of the willing type of approach to ASEAN, we are not only dealing with the ASEAN as a whole, but I think each nation inside the ASEAN have become more, I think, important. And especially on that case that the Singapore is the one and the Indonesia as a chair of the G20, if those countries will take a more robust leadership to lead ASEAN to be more competitive among those different regional framework, that might be the things that we should approach to ASEAN more robustly.
Ken. It's a really challenging issue for the Quad, and another one that's related is, should the Quad stay at 4, or should it expand, right? And this came up in several of the remarks. Hayley, you brought this up in particular, but there have been these questions about whether the Quad should become the Quint, or even expand more broadly. At the moment, there is a bit of cooperation with other countries at the Quad meetings. So there have been observers from other countries at some of those meetings. And in fact, the working groups have been inviting certain countries to cooperate with the working groups, for example, on supply chain issues. But this question of expansion of the Quad, I'm wondering if any of you believe that it would be wise to include other countries in the Quad. The United Kingdom has talked about potentially being interested, so is South Korea. Do any of you think that expanding the Quad would be a smart idea at the moment? No one. I think this is interesting because the more that the Quad acts as sort of a critical regional bloc, the more interest there is from outside the Quad to have some countries at least be part of a Quad plus format. But I think it's interesting that there is some hesitation about this.
Well, Zach,
Misha, go ahead.
I would say, look, I think so. There are models for the plus. You have ASEAN plus. You do have observers that can come in and at least get familiarized with what's going on, and then it can affect their bilateral relations, or they can even become, they can participate in certain aspects and elements. So I don't think it's institutionally or structurally a problem to say let's have a plus. I think the bigger issue is conceptual. It's what do you actually want to do, and if what we're really moving towards is a grouping of liberal nations, which of course the Quad is to begin with, then you need ultimately you need to embrace that directly, either to say yes or no. I think in some ways what's going on in Ukraine helps make that clearer. However long it's going to be, the next decade or the next generation, we seem to have a much clearer divide now between liberal and illiberal nations, the use of force, multilateral institutions. Some, think that Ukraine, for example, has revitalized NATO. It may have revitalized this sort of more amorphous liberal order. But at a minimum, to think that liberal nations should be getting together to be talking about security. So the Quad, of course, half of the Quad, 3/4 of the Quad already is in an alliance structure, right? The US and Australia, and then the US and Japan. Something we haven't mentioned yet is AUKUS, which is also two alliances, Europe and Asia and the United States. Maybe we should be talking about whether Japan goes into AUKUS and it becomes JAUKUS because it is more security oriented. I thought Brahma's point was actually interesting, in which he said, the Quad cannot be, if I have it right, what he said, cannot create a stable balance of power. Brahma, I think it was something along those lines. Correct me if I'm wrong. And yet, in some ways, it's placed to do so because of the 3/4 of it that already is in a formal alliance, and India, which has been talking about sea lane security, security stretching from the South China Sea into the Indian Ocean, the Andaman area, critical sea lanes of communication and choke points such as the Malacca Strait. So in some ways, I agree. If you're not going to have an armed Quad like NATO patrolling the seas, although our warships and navies are already out there doing that, but to ignore or maybe not take advantage of what's already happening, I think equally misses the point and actually gives an immediacy of effort or an immediacy of purpose to the Quad that at least we should be thinking about. And that, I think, is then when you start talking about other partners coming in, the UK, I think, being a critical one, France potentially with all of the French territories in the Indo-Pacific as well.
Let me build on something you said, Misha, and ask the final question before we open it up to the audience. And as a reminder for the audience, please go to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens if you want to ask a question, and just provide us your name and affiliation along with your question. So Misha, you mentioned Ukraine. It hasn't really come up yet in the discussion, but I think it will be hard to avoid in a week when the Quad meets. Obviously, you know, there's a little bit of tensions within the Quad on Ukraine. Japan, Australia, and the United States have been quite active in critiquing Russia and applying sanctions. And obviously, India has a long-standing relationship with Russia, which is in many ways very important to Indian foreign policy and to Indian defense policy. So India has a different position on this. How much do you think that Ukraine will be critical at the upcoming Quad meeting? And do you think that the Ukraine-Russia relationships that each of the Quad members have are going to be a challenge for Quad cooperation going forward? I think, Brahma, you know, you noted a little bit about this, so maybe we could turn to you first.
Well, you know, there was a virtual summit earlier in March that Biden initiated, and he attempted to bring Ukraine and European security into the Quad agenda. But that summit didn't go very far because India opposed the expansion of the Quad agenda to Ukraine and European security. So I guess in Tokyo, there'll be no attempt to repeat what was tried out in March. I think the purpose of the Tokyo meeting is to clearly set the direction for the Quad's coming months and coming years, set a clear direction so that the Quad can become a robust initiative. But if I could turn to this larger issue about Ukraine and how it has become a divisive issue. First, I think it's important to keep in mind that this is a conflict now between Russia and the West, because the entire Western world has come together to impose unprecedented sanctions on Moscow. But we should not forget that much of the non-Western world has declined to take sides in what is emerging as a new Cold War. If you look at the world's major non-Western democracies, from Brazil and Mexico to South Africa and Indonesia, they've all charted a course of neutrality. So India is not alone. India is part of this non-Western world. It's part of the Quad, but it's also part of the non-Western world. That's a reality. And now, again, about India. India holds more annual military exercises with the US than any other country. And not many people know this. US arms sales to India have in recent years far surpassed Russian defense equipment sales to India. The US is also India's largest trading partner. And the almost $150 billion goods and services trade that India has with the US dwarfs India's trade with Russia. India's trade with Russia is only about $12 billion. However, there's an important reason why India is hesitant to join the US-led anti-Russia alliance, because India feels that such a coalition will not only drive Moscow into a closer embrace with Beijing, but also exacerbate India's regional security challenges by aiding the further rise of an expansionist China. How many know that India faces its own aggression today? A Chinese aggression on the border. There are some 200,000 rival Chinese and Indian forces locked in standoffs, many of them in eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation for almost 2 years now. And the two countries are on a war footing in the Somalian border region. So given the fact that India faces its own border aggression, India's concern is that the US-led sanctions will effectively put Russia is the world's richest country in natural resources. It'll put Russia in the pocket of a resource-hungry China. And the main brunt of the rise of a more powerful and aggressive China will be borne by its neighbors, especially India. Japan and Australia are under the US security and nuclear umbrella, but India must deal with China on its own, as the current Himalayan military crisis shows. And look at another irony. Biden wants India to side with the US against Russia. But Biden has still not uttered a single word on China's ongoing border aggression against India. This aggression has triggered the largest Himalayan buildup of rival forces in history. In fact, in keeping with Biden's outreach to Beijing, his State Department, equating the victim with the aggressor, has urged India to find, quote unquote, a peaceful resolution with China. The US is unwilling to take sides in this China-India dispute, but it wants India to come to America's side against Russia, even if it means compounding India's security challenges. So that's the background that one has to keep in mind in understanding why India is hesitant to jump on the US bandwagon.
Well, Brahma, we've got a couple of great questions from the audience that I think are related to some of the points you raised. And one of the things that's very interesting about the Quad is that each of the four countries, they really do have slightly different focuses when it comes to security issues. Obviously, the Sino-Indian border is a big focus for India. But for Japan, it's really the East China Sea and the Senkaku Islands. For the United States, I think increasingly it's focused on Taiwan and the Taiwan Strait. And then for Australia, we've got a whole range of issues, but I think the Pacific Islands are at the top of the list. And we have a question from a researcher at Waseda University who asks about the security pact between the Solomon Islands and China. And so, Hayley, I want to turn to you and ask this question. Is there a role for the Quad to manage these kinds of challenges, with Chinese influence abroad, particularly in the Pacific Islands? Or is this something better done perhaps by Australia or bilaterally between Australia and the United States, New Zealand and others? Is this a Quad role, or is the Quad better focused in other areas?
Well, I think if you ask Brahma that question, he would agree with me in saying that the Pacific is not a high priority of India's, and therefore it doesn't really represent good value for money in terms of a Quad area for cooperation. That said, yes, for those of you who are aware of it, recently China and the Solomon Islands struck a new defence pact, and that has caused a lot of concern in Australia, especially in the lead up to our election campaign, with the current government wanting to look tough on national security and talking out quite, loudly about red lines. I really cringed when I heard that line because I thought of poor President Obama and his red line comment. But the issue of Chinese influence in the region is something that is affecting all four Quad nations, but I don't see the Pacific as being an area for Quad cooperation. Yes, the United States and Japan have been in the Pacific, but Australia really is a leader within the Pacific family, what we call the Pacific family. And a couple of years ago, we already recognized that China was increasing its influence there, including through its Belt and Road Infrastructure Initiative. And back then, Australia announced a policy called Pacific Step Up, where basically Australia was going to reinvest in its relationships in the Pacific to avoid this, a vacuum being created and China coming in and offering the Pacific Island countries really attractive deals, including this defence pact. What concerns me about this defence pact, the text of which was leaked via Twitter. So we're not actually sure if that's exactly the text that was agreed to. But if it is, the concerning feature for that and the problem for the rules-based order is just how vague that agreement is. It's almost like offering China a blank check to the Solomon Islands so that if there is any more unrest in the Solomon Islands, which last time was caused by a political disagreement about recognition or not of Taiwan, that China could come in with its security and military forces to really reinforce its embassy there and help the Solomon Islands government. Now, in the past, Australia has been the security partner of choice for the Solomons, and we do remain that way. But, there is this concern about the creep to China for Pacific Island countries. So what we need to do together, I think, not as a quad, but probably trilaterally, Australia, Japan, and the United States, is think about how we're going to deliver more compelling alternatives, including infrastructure. And that really is a big problem because infrastructure is extremely expensive. Often there's some level of corruption or kind of greasing the wheels. That's why in the past I've suggested one of the good areas for infrastructure cooperation, which is less controversial too because it doesn't actually go on territory, is undersea fiber optic cables. That's a good way to kind of secure Pacific Islands, which can be really disrupted. So, for example, earlier this year, another Pacific Island nation, Tonga, had an earthquake and it was cut off from the world because its submarine cable was disrupted. So we really need to think, what do Pacific Island nations need, and work with them to deliver those things so they don't go looking for it elsewhere.
That's a great point, Hayley. Ken, I want to turn to you with another question, this time actually from a student at Macquarie University in Australia. So the question is about the role of the Quad and what I'll call sort of values issues, right? Human rights and democracy, which is something we haven't talked that much about this morning, but is obviously a part of the Quad, right? We often talk about how the Quad is a grouping of 4 leading democracies. But the questioner says excessive intervention on these kinds of values issues could be a wedge creator, right? It could allow China or Russia to drive wedges between the Quad countries, or maybe between the Quad and other groups, say Southeast Asian partners, right? Notoriously, only 3 of the 10 members of ASEAN were actually invited to the Summit for Democracy here in Washington last year. So there are these questions about how much the Quad should focus on human rights or democracy issues. So Ken, what do you think about the value of talking about these issues within the Quad, or should they really be secondary to a broader set of interests?
Yeah, I wish I had answer to this very difficult question. But I think that we all agree that pursuing the goal, which is unachievable, will only dilute the effectiveness of the Quad, which leaves the China and other players to take a wedge among ourselves. But that said, it doesn't mean that the Quad should be leading the platform of the regional order. And I think one of the baseline of the platform is how much we can really internationalize the issue that we face in our region. Because, for example, China tried to make their own issue as a domestic ones, either on Taiwan, South China Sea, and even the East China Sea. But when the Quad members, and together with the European, nations, try to engage in those problems, and then regard them as their own issues, and that issues will become more internationalized with their commitments. So this is the part of the reason of our a demonstration of our presence, operations. The Malabar that many mentions, that it's not only taking place in the Indian Ocean, but also take place in the South China Sea, and also the other areas, which also demonstrate how much we are concerned with the issue that we face in the each of region. Doesn't mean that we are operate together in the actual sense, but it does mean that we commit to the common values that we care with each other. But again, that as you mentioned, that Asia is a diverse nation, and especially specific issue like how to deal with Vietnam, strategically very important nations that we have lots of potential for exploiting the strategic cooperation with them. But once that the value issues come in, democracy, human rights, and all that things, those kind of potential will be very much squeezed with each other. So I think that I think we should look at more practical way that what will be the most effective way to set the platform with each other. Once that all the other superficial kind of value concept comes into the projects, that's going to be counterproductive in I think promoting the actual cooperation among ourselves.
Jack, if I could add something to what
course.
Ken had. I agree with Ken, and I think it's important not to get too much into this democracy versus autocracy narrative, because this narrative can be quite self-constraining. Now, if you look at the Quad, every Quad joint statement talks about ASEAN centrality. And Jack, you mentioned that Biden invited only 3 ASEAN members to his democracy summit. The fact is that out of the 10 ASEAN member states, only 2 are genuine democracies with traditional independence and free press. So one has to be very careful, because if you frame international issues in this democracy versus autocracy narrative, you're going to be constraining your foreign policy options. In fact, one of the reasons why several states in the Middle East, including Persian Gulf sheikdoms, did not support some of the UN resolutions that were sponsored by the US or by the Western Bloc over Ukraine invasion of Russia, is because of this narrative: democracy versus autocracy. These are all autocracies in the Middle East. Similarly, I think to simplify the Ukraine war, to turn it into turn Ukraine into a symbol of freedom and liberal democracy, distorts the reality. The fact is that Ukraine has a record of increasingly repressive policies under Zelensky. He has banned opposition parties, he has jailed political opponents, he has shut down independent media outlets. In fact, Ukraine under him is one of the most corrupt nations in the world. And therefore, this simplistic narrative, that this is the democracy versus autocracy struggle, even though, I'm all for human rights, for promoting democracy, but this kind of narrative we should avoid, because it distorts the realities.
Well, thanks. I think this is just going to be more and more of an issue going forward, as the Biden administration thinks about releasing its national security strategy. And, the interim guidance it released was very much about democracy versus autocracy. And I think we've heard the president reinforce that language recently. So I think this is a very difficult tension, definitely in the United States, but I'm sure for some of the other Quad members as well. Well, we only have about 5 or 10 minutes left. So Misha, I want to turn to you with a question from one of the participants from Singapore, which is about supply chains and the Quad, which is not something we've touched on yet. But this role of the Quad and economic security issues, right? This is a difficult one. And obviously, I think you're in Washington, but you've got a beautiful view of Silicon Valley behind you. So we have to ask you the supply chain question. How should the Quad play a role on supply chain issues? Do you think, for example, the supply chain working group that the Quad has set up, is that a core issue that the Quad is well positioned to deal with? How do you think about that and its role in the Quad?
Well, I have a Silicon Valley background. I'm not a supply chain person or even really much of economic security, but I think your question gets to a core. Let me just start with sort of a meta question, and there's 2 of them, which is, and I'm not sure that we've actually even really grappled with this yet this morning, which is, number one, what do we want? And when I say we, all 4 partners, what do we actually want out of the Quad? We already have bilateral relations. We have alliances amongst 3 of the 4, close partnership, increasingly close between the US and India, as Brahma has mentioned. So what is the plus alpha, as Japanese would say, or what is the value added, as we would say in America, of the Quad? That's number one. The second question is, all of these countries that we're talking about that we want to have some sort of relationship with outside of the Quad, but with the Quad, what do they want? And there's actually a question from the Philippines about that. What are the benefits that we're going to get out of it? And I'm not sure we've actually answered those questions. I think Brahma's points about democracy versus autocracy are really important. Sitting in Washington and spending part of the year in California, I would like us to make it about democracy versus autocracy. I don't think you can avoid that issue anymore. That doesn't mean that you don't work with nations however you can, but I think if you're not being clear, and I think it was Hayley said it earlier, we have to be talking about the benefits of our system. If you're not doing that, then what's the point of working with us? We don't do infrastructure, and we should do infrastructure. That should have been something we've been doing for a generation. We don't do a lot of these things that nations actually want. So on supply chains, I don't understand how the Quad is going to deal with supply chains when we can't get baby formula in the United States. We've got hundreds of ships piled up outside of Long Beach, San Francisco, New York. We have our own supply chain problems, and I don't see how the Quad is in any way going to be able to really address the question of supply chains, which seem so specialist. I don't think any of us here are really qualified probably to actually talk about supply chains. We can understand it in terms of certain, and I would put it in this way, national security goals, semiconductor chips. We learned through COVID, PPP, personal protective equipment, and the like. All of these things are very important. But after 2 years, and I think it was Brahma who said it, we're actually more dependent on China than we were before COVID. So we've done nothing to secure our supply chains. We've done nothing to secure really our semiconductor dependency, although there may be some things starting in Arizona and Ohio. So I think to talk about how the Quad can do it, to me, it seems to be such a bridge too far, unless we get some really smart supply chain people, unlike me, to talk to us about what the Quad can actually do. But it worries me that we're all just sitting here looking at years potentially of shortages ahead, and then we have a supply chain working group. It seems divorced from reality.
I think this is a really challenging question for the Quad, right? So we all want the Quad, I think, to be successful, and yet what we've raised here this morning is, in many ways, the Quad is about China, or it's inspired by dealing with issues related to China. But the more the Quad tries to do, the less focus it has on any one issue. And so whether it's supply chain issues or global warming or pandemic relief, it does seem like we've now reached the point where the question isn't what the Quad can do in any of these areas. It's really a question of prioritization, right? And where the Quad can have the most effect. And I think we've hit on a lot of these issues, right? We've talked about whether the Quad should focus on democracy and human rights issues, whether it should talk about supply chains, whether it should really talk openly about China, where it should operate, whether that's in the Pacific Islands or in the Southeast Asia with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. But I think what all this drives towards is a week from now, when the Quad leaders meet, it's going to be really important for them to start delivering results, right? And I think there have been a lot of commitments made, but many of us are looking for those results. And I think that's a great place for us to end this discussion. It's been so wonderful having all 4 of you here. Thank you, Misha, Hayley, Brahma, and Ken for your comments and insights. I think we've delved into a lot, but we probably could have gone another hour or two, and there certainly are many, many more questions from the audience, but we are out of time. So let me just say for the audience, If you go down to the bottom of your screen below the webinar, you will find a link that will send you to an assessment of the program, and we'd urge you to go ahead and click on that link. And please stay tuned for additional events in the Asia Undercurrent series. So the next webinar will be in June, and you can go to the Asia Undercurrent website or to Twitter to find out more information. So with that, let me just thank Misha, Hayley, Brahma, and Ken for joining us this morning, and look forward to seeing you all again at the next event in June. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you.